Welcome to Living Wealthy Radio with your host, Teresa Kuhn.
Good afternoon. You're listening to Living Wealthy Radio, heard every Sunday at noon here on Talk Radio, 1370 AM, streaming live at talk1370.com. I'm Teresa Kuhn, helping you live wealthier. Resources are available for you at livingwealthyradio.com. Who controls today's conversation about what education should be in the classroom? Bill Gates, the media, politicians? Why? What about the teachers? Where is their voice? Social experiments and assumptions aside, shouldn't we follow the models implemented by the successful teachers who inspire and train and motivate our children? With one-size-fits-all models like Common Core being thrust upon us and our kids, isn't it time to step back and think about the role of the teacher in the classroom and how that human element can make all the difference? Our guest today, David Green, educator, author, and champion of experiential learning. He's going to help us better understand why we need a system of education that gives teachers the freedom and flexibility to focus on our children individually, to inspire them to be great in their own ways. David, what is experiential learning?
Experiential learning, and thank you, by the way, for having me on the show.
Oh, my pleasure.
Sure. Experiential learning comes about in a number of ways. It can come about within a classroom, and it can come about by programs that allow students, especially high school students, to learn about something they're passionate about outside the classroom. Inside the classroom, they revolve more around project-based learning, where there's a problem to be solved or there's an issue to be dealt with. Or it might be as simple as teaching physics in elementary school with popsicle sticks about how to build a bridge to support a toy truck to go over it. That's experiential learning because it's hands-on. It's doing rather than being told or actually even playing around with a computer screen. At the high school level, it can be a program such as the WISE program that I'm affiliated with that has high school second semester seniors, including, by the way, both of my own children, who, for English and social studies credit, go out, work on a project of their own interest that could be so wide-ranging, and they have a mentor in the school, as a teacher or staff member they work with, as well as an outside expert outside the school, where they go about learning more about the project and reading about it and writing about it and experimenting with it, giving a presentation at the end, so that they also can show what they've learned, how they've learned it, and how they've grown as a result of it, all with an assessment that's narrative and far more important in terms of student growth than something we get in a multiple choice test.
Well, give me examples, specific examples of what one of these projects would look like.
Well, I'll give you, for example, my son, who did it. When he was a sophomore in high school, he had an interest in potentially becoming a doctor. When he was a senior and he was allowed to do this, he was doing this program. What he was able to do was work with an orthopedist in a hospital setting. In the school that he went to, the program was full-time for 6 weeks, the last 6 weeks of the school. So he did 30 hours a week working with him and also a physical therapist. So he really got an understanding of what orthopedics was, what the life of an orthopedic surgeon was, and what the same thing was true with the head of a physical training group within the Hospital for Special Surgery. So he was able to do that. He observed the surgeries, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of this whole thing, he came out convinced that he did want to be a doctor. He is now a second-year med student at Tulane.
Awesome.
So that's career exploration. On the other hand, I'll give you another case in point, another actual career explorer who was a senior who never, in his own words, never liked high school. He was a gadfly. Teachers didn't like him because he had the audacity to speak for himself. He wanted to, when he was a junior, he wanted to put together a newspaper, a magazine that did sports, because he thought at some point in the future he wanted to be a sports journalist. So he decided to do that, except he ran into trouble with the principal and the teacher in the school who was head of the student activities, who said, you cannot compete with the school newspaper. And of course, he said, but the school newspapers are free. There's no competition. There's no competing against it. So they said you could do something, but it only can do with outside sports. It can't do with inside the school sports. So he went and did that. The following year, because he asked me to be the advisor to that, he asked me to be his mentor in this program. I said, sure. What do you want to do? What are you interested in? He says, well, I want to explore another avenue in journalism. I love reading Stuart Elliott, who was the advertising editor of the New York Times, and I'm going to go get a job with him. And I said, do you realize how hard that is? The New York Times barely takes college interns. He said, yeah, but I'm going to try. So he was very perseverant. He kept contacting him. We might call it badgering. Stuart Elliott finally gave him an interview, and allowed him to work. He says, but no one else can know what you're really doing here. You're going to come every day as a guest, and I'll just give you things to do, and you can learn the trade. So he was sitting at Stuart Elliott's desk one day, and a woman came over, and this was in 1995. So this was the very fledgling column about technology that now appears on a 3-page long Tuesday, section in the Times. And she saw him, and he was explaining to somebody why modems made noise. If you remember all those telephone modems,
sure,
they would go, sound more like a wounded duck. So he explained it. Says, okay, write a paragraph about that. And so now he writes the paragraph about it. He gets in, no byline. They said that was wonderful. He had to give up who he was because now he had an identity. Well, it turned out to be Andrew Ross Sorkin, the author of Too Big to Fail, and he has been working for the Times, and he actually wrote a major essay in the New York Times Magazine about Bill Gates and his big history thing. So those are two career exploration. Kids have done everything from studying the culture of surfing to going to New Zealand, to the land, I didn't know this, but it's the land of geckos. And so he went to New Zealand to study with a professor because he had pet geckos and he wanted to explore more about that lizard, I guess. So there have been, in our program, and there are other programs like it, but in our program over the last 40 years, they've had about 40,000 different stories about different kids doing different things, ranging from, I want to be a second-grade teacher, and so let me go back in my second-grade teacher's classroom to a couple of the stories that I told you. But each one of them, based upon the interest and desire of the particular student.
So you used to teach high school, right?
Yes.
And when did you first realize that the whole educational system was going in the wrong direction?
Well, first of all, that's a misnomer. It's not true.
What part's not true?
That the whole education system is going in the wrong direction.
Got it.
It's perspective, and it depends upon the source of your information. So, for example, when you poll parents about their individual schools rate B, B+, and higher. But when you poll them about the state of education as a whole, it's a C or a D. So the question is, why is that? When you take a look at it, there are three common denominators that determine whether a school and or a district is successful. One is affluence. The second thing the second issue are the social environments that go along with the level of affluence or lack of in that in that district. And the third, interestingly enough, that I found out through research, is mother's educational attainment level. So where you have districts where those three are positive, the schools are great. Where you have districts, mostly in poor urban areas and poor rural areas, the schools are bad, and there is a systematic problem to be solved. So it's not the whole education system. It's really a district-by-district, school-by-school phenomenon that we have to look at. And it's much more complex than what a lot of people would have you believe.
Well, isn't Common Core about centralizing and making every district, every school system look and operate and feel the same way?
Well, that is a response to the issue that I just said, because not every not every school system needs to be uplifted. In fact, for many schools and many school districts, what the Common Core asks them to do actually brings down the standards that they have been working on. In New York State, that happens particularly because New York State has always had a set of K through 12 standards, syllabi, suggested curricula. Now, Common Core really is short for Common Core State Standards because legally, through two federal acts, the United States government, federal government, cannot, by law, create a standardized curriculum across all 50 states and its territories. So they don't use the word curriculum; they use the word standards. But because they can't create it, the National Governors Association, along with several foundations, put together, hired a group called Achieve Inc., headed by David Coleman, who also is the head of ETS, a testing service that gives us things like the AP exams and the College Board, and funded a great deal by Bill Gates and other foundations, decided that they needed to have a set of common, and I'll use their words, standards, because since 2001, we've had sets of high-stakes standardized testing going on, and they realized, well, how can we have sets of sort of national or statewide sets of high-stakes tests if we don't have something standard to test them on? So the Common Core came about last in this sequence, and I always tell people it's just the tip of the iceberg, but the major part of the iceberg has been developing for decades below the surface of the water that we haven't seen. So in some cases, look, as I said earlier, in some cases, the generic themes and ideas of the Common Core state standards are necessary. Look, who's against better critical thinking? Who's against higher reading skills? Who's against better problem-solving skills? Who's against getting kids ready to get out of high school and live their life, whatever they choose to do? All of those are great and grand ideas, but depending upon the district and state you've been in, some have been far more successful at doing that than others. So this is, again, I point out, it's far more complex than we've been led to believe.
So what is your solution, or what do you recommend?
For which question?
To change let's talk about the high school experience for kids.
Sure.
You talk about experiential learning and how important that is for kids. Why? Well, go ahead.
No. I'll finish your question.
Okay, so implementing some kind of experiential learning experience, obviously involving the kids and getting them involved in something that they're interested in is much more interesting and exciting than sitting in a classroom all day long, right?
Exactly.
And so it's very obvious, or at some level it's very obvious why something like that would be so great for the kids and how kids would be motivated to participate. But how would you shift or change or tweak the educational experience for high schoolers today? If you had a magic wand, what would you do?
It's an interesting question, and I and colleagues that I've worked with ever since I started teaching back in 1970 have always been trying to answer that question and trying to solve it in our own small ways wherever we could in our own schools. And I was lucky enough to have schools and leaders of schools who allowed us to experiment with ideas that would help make our students' experiences better and have a better outcome for them. 3 years ago, I actually gave a workshop in Washington, D.C. as part of the Save Our Schools March and Conference that was more famous for Matt Damon being there than anything else, called Reinvigorating the American High School. And obviously, not everything is going to be interesting. There are things that are necessary to learn that just don't generate interest. And again, that's also individual. So, for example, foreign language was foreign to me and totally uninteresting. But to other kids, it was something they reveled in. History and literature are things that other kids love. So you can't go necessarily by that, but you have to give them an opportunity to do it. And as a capstone for high school seniors who have already gone through the requirements that we as a society have deemed necessary for success in future life. As a capstone, this experiential learning is, I think, extremely important because it allows them to physically apply the information that they've learned. And I've always been one who's supported the idea that we need to learn how to manipulate information and not have information manipulate us. And the only way you can do that is through application. But as far as the regular classroom is concerned, there's a lot to be done there as well. And what can be done there is very simply based upon what we know has worked. The more students are engaged and involved in their learning, no matter whether or not the subject is interesting to them or not, the better they do. And so what we have to continuously base our experiment in education on, because our education is always an experiment, we're always trying to see what works best, is how can you get individual kids who are so different from one another to be engaged in a subject they all have to learn. And that takes a set of skills and a set of understandings that the best teachers have, and they know how to develop relationships. They know how to develop a connection between students that draws the best out of them because they understand how they learn best. One of the questions that always comes up is the one about assessment, and the question between standardized tests and assessments. Well, one of the things that I learned when I was in second grade is that we all learn separate, and this was because of my second grade teacher, who is the model for everything I have ever done since then. She understood that each of us has our own interests and our own means of developing them, and she understood how to reach each one of us. And she gave us opportunities to express how we learned what we learned differently. Some, even in second grade, and this is true, some kids are better at expressing what they've learned through writing. Some are better at expressing what they've learned through action. Some are they're again very so you're linear learning, you have tactile learning, you have oral, AURAL, because you learn better through listening. So you have to have a situation where all the senses are used to teach kids. Not all at the same time, because that would be sensory overload, but to allow the learning style of each kid to come through. And also in the flip side of that, when you assess them, to allow the best, they have to learn how to be assessed in all these areas, but they also have to be given the opportunity to express themselves in the ways that they best can do that. And so it's a combination of all of those things, and I think, which include group learning, which include simulations, which include primarily discussion of things, and the art of questioning that teachers develop is so important in doing that, to be able to get kids to be able to not just answer with a one-word guttural response, but to be able to start with the one-word guttural response and then go on and explain what they mean and why they think that. So those are all things that we can do, and the best schools and the best teachers do them. And what we need to do as a nation is to stop searching for answers from pie-in-the-sky people or corporations and simply say, well, we have thousands of wonderful models. Let's use them and find ways to get those models to be spread around the rest of the country. What's interesting to note is that the international star of education, Finland, besides all the other factors that have ranked it number one, when they redeveloped their school system in the early 1990s, and it was a miserable school system before that, they really did answer your question as a nation. Do you know what they modeled their primary learning processes on?
No clue.
What we were doing in the United States in the 1960s and 70s.
So what were we doing back then?
What I'm telling you now. This kind of inquiry-based learning, discussion-based learning, student-centered learning, where the student is not where the teacher is not controlling the class. The teacher is rather conducting the class the same way a jazz band leader, and I'm using that analogy specifically, a jazz band leader, even the composer of the piece understands that there's a central core of the piece, but at the same time he has to give his instrumentalist the right to improvise and show off what they can do. And that's, in a nutshell, the kind of stuff that the United States, many schools, many high schools especially, were working on.
So is this in any way like the Socratic method of teaching? That's
that they use actually one of them. That's one of the methods that is used.
Okay, because I did go to law school, and that is a very, very effective way of engaging the student in the conversation instead of the teacher providing the information. The student is engaged in having to communicate and have a discussion.
It's far different from the Kingsfield model in the paper chase.
Exactly. And
that's the difference.
Okay. So that's what you're talking about. And I think most of our listeners are familiar, at least, with the Socratic method, where they're questions. It's question-based learning.
It is questions-based learning, and where the teacher is a facilitator and a guide, as opposed to what too many people think teachers, especially at the high school level's job, is of imparting information. And that's not our job. Our job is to allow kids to sift through the information, and just as a lawyer needs to, find the evidence to support your point of view or case, and then be able to present it in a means that's clear, understandable, and convincing.
Mm-hmm. Our guest today is David Green, and we are discussing the role of the teacher in the classroom. Our kids are individuals. They deserve an education that recognizes this, and we'll discuss this and much more when we return from a quick break. This is Teresa Kuhn with Living Wealthy Radio.
Living Wealthy Radio. Visit Teresa's team online at livingwealthyradio.com, 1-800-382-0830 now. Call 1-800-382-0830.
Welcome back, Austin, to Living Wealthy Radio with Teresa Kuhn.
If you're just now joining us, we're speaking with educator and advocate of experiential learning, David Green, about how our educational system is changing to a one-size-fits-all approach and how outstanding teachers are the solution. So, David, share with us your thinking on boys in the modern classroom. What is the problem, and why are boys failing?
This is an interesting thing, and actually I started getting involved in this because of a very personal issue. My son, who I mentioned earlier, is now a second-year med student. When he was younger, and he's one of those kids who's like the youngest in his grade because of his birthday. So he had a little maturity issues because he was so young. We were getting calls from teachers. They wanted to test him. They thought he had ADHD, and he was disruptive, but he really wasn't. He was curious and vocal. As I was when I was in the first grade, way back in the 1950s, when I was in the first grade, and my mother was called in because my first grade teacher wanted to have me tested. So this sort of bing rang a bell, and I was very curious about what was going on. So I started doing some research in the field. And this was right after the early 1990s push for equity in schools based upon gender. Schools like books like, I think, Raising Ophelia were out there, and as teachers, we were being taught through our professional development how to get girls to come out of that sort of wallflower kind of stage that they were in, and to become more as assertive as some of the boys had been. And all of that was absolutely necessary, and it was, again, part of the idea of individualizing. You have to understand what makes kids tick to be able to get them to be more successful. So I started doing some research in it. I met some other people who were doing research in it, and in the school district that I had, I was sent to a conference at Wellesley. It was a women's college who was doing a conference on the study of boys in schools. And so I presented some of the findings and basically got hooted because their idea of the issue with boys is that you had to train them to be less like boys. So I eventually, somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, would you mind if I interviewed you? I'm writing a book. It was Christine Hoff Sommers, who wrote the book, The War Against Boys. And so part of the research I had done, anecdotally, was included in the book. So I got even more interested and started to do more. So what I found, to get to the question, is that basically we have, and this is true just totally in education these days. This is one of the issues that we have to deal with, as you mentioned earlier, this top-down approach. We have failed to pay attention to any of the sociological, pedagogical, and biological research. And so one of the most consistent findings in research is that over the past, not just 12 years, but 30, almost 20 to 30 years, as schools have moved to teaching methods that favor more about how schools learn, more linear learning, reading and writing, and kind of straightforward, and standardized test-taking is part of that. And so when they added that, they kind of looked at that and they said, well, at the same time we're doing more of this, boys seem to be doing more, boys seem to be far less successful, and they're faring less and less well in school. And then we begin to see that there is a crisis. So little by little, more and more people started asking the question, because from the 1970s on, you didn't want to ask that question because then you would be a sexist. And we realize that you can't be a sexist if you're trying to help all kids and find out what they need to do individually. And if there are gender issues involved, then you need to be able to help girls in the way that makes them better learners and help boys in the way that makes them better learners. So other people jumped on board, one of whom is a woman by the name of Peg Tyre, Tyre, who wrote an article in Newsweek when she was a journalist there, and then went on to write a book, The Trouble with Boys. And I've spoken with her on this subject, and she always starts out everything by saying, I'm a feminist, but I have 2 sons. And because I have 2 sons, I had to learn some things I didn't want to learn. And so some of the things that we've learned, for example, and some quick statistics, recent studies, this goes back, it's about 10 years, but the percentages are roughly the same. The rate of all male students graduating high school is about 7% lower than the rate of all female students.
Can you repeat that, please?
The rate at which male students graduate high school is 7% lower than the rate at which female students graduate high school.
Okay.
The rate at which all black males graduate high schools is 23% lower than the rate of all female students graduating high school. So those are high school statistics. What gets more educated people to understand it is actually what goes on in college, which is worse. It's approaching a 60-40% admissions rate in college, female to male.
It's crazy. I know.
Well, what's crazier is that for every 100 men who graduate college, 137 women graduate. For every 100 men who get a master's degree, over 130 have earned a master's degree. And the rates keep getting higher year by year, so that the rate at which, I think the chart, this is done by the U.S. Department of Education. By 2019, what they're predicting is that it used to be about a 2-to-1 ratio. Males to females graduating college in the early 60s, and they're predicting by 2019 that will have flipped, a 2-to-1 ratio of women graduating college compared to men. So these are statistics by national standards, by the Bureau of Labor, by the Department of Education, by groups who are very reliable in their findings. And so what they've also found is that if you take a look at any high school, boys are greatly outnumbered in every extracurricular activity outside of sports. By 12, they're twice as likely to have repeated a grade in school. They are 3 times as likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, 10 times, and this is what actually started my hunt in this, they are 10 times as likely to be referred for possible ADHD testing, especially in the early grades. They're 5 times as likely to commit suicide, and 3 times as likely to be expelled. And the funniest one, although it's the saddest one at the same time, and especially as we're now starting universal pre-K here in New York City, preschool boys are expelled at a rate of about 4.5 times the rate of girls. Expelled from preschool. That's the kind of stuff that we're doing. So that when you take a look at it, and here I am, maybe the average boy of, oh God, this is going to be hurtful to say, 50 to 75 years ago, 50 is more likely. The average boy of, let's say, 50 years ago would be very likely to be diagnosed or referred to be diagnosed with ADHD today, especially if they were bored and gifted. So that's the situation we're facing. And this quest for standardization and prepping for tests simply has exacerbated the problem even greater than these statistics have shown.
As the mother of a boy, right? And I've watched my son, and we've used alternative educational methods for my child, because I learned in my studying that boys learn differently than girls. And in my opinion, and I'm not an expert at this, but in my opinion, the educational system is geared towards linear learning and really geared towards teaching girls.
That's what the research has found.
Fit very nicely inside a classroom, and they get along very nicely in your typical classroom.
They're more emotive. They get along with adult women better, who are the predominant staff teachers, especially in the elementary schools. They learn to read faster. One of the interesting things in brain science that I found out, and this study has been replicated a number of times, is that when you look at the cognitive development and ability to learn to read, the average 5-year-old boy, when compared to the average 5-year-old girl, is more like a 3.5-year-old girl. And so they're asking this child who behaviorally, cognitively, and biologically is anywhere from, on average, a year to 2 years behind emotionally, socially, and cognitively to do these kinds of things at an increased rate, where they're now forcing kids to learn how to read in kindergarten who are not ready. And what happens is they don't want to learn. They get frustrated. They feel as if they're failures. And what happens with boys, more so than girls, is they tend to fight or flight. And so they either fight or show some negative emotion, which says, oh, you have to be referred, or they just withdraw and choose not to. Which is often the case.
Right, and that's so sad, because at a very early age, they become labeled and they internalize that school is not a safe, fun place for them.
Yes.
And they carry that forward for years. And,
yes.
I mean, here's the proof, right? For so long, and yes, it was necessary for girls to have the same opportunities as boys. Absolutely, yep. Without a doubt. But I think what's happened is that shift, right, has made it where boys don't feel welcome at school, and unless they're able to figure out a way to fit into school, they're left out.
Yeah, and when we think about things in a historical manner, because I taught history and I'm a historian, and when I look back and I try to compare what's gone on through various ages of education in this country, when we now talk about, in the 21st century, the college and career-ready skills really aren't that much different. For those people, we want to have leadership skills, as opposed to those people we just want to be laborers. So we teach people to be obedient, to be laborers, which is what this top-down public school system kind of thing is going on now. But the people who want to be leaders go to private schools, and they learn to lead. And they don't have. And interesting, private schools, and for those classes of people, do not follow. They do not have to follow Common Core. They don't have to take standardized tests. They can still do freely the kinds of things that all kids were able to do in all public schools. So we're creating this two-class system. And when we take a look at the one thing that everyone learned, the one method everyone learned, male or female, males perhaps more, it's the concept of apprenticeship. And what's apprenticeship? Experiential learning. And more, that's being taken away. In many kindergarten classes, you don't even have block time anymore because they have to learn to read faster, even if they're not ready.
And boys, everybody knows, boys need to move. All kids need to move, but especially boys. They're just so, large motor skill driven.
Yes.
And really what we're having, and I know this, I work with money. I have a ton of clients that are single women who tell me they can't find men that are responsible and that are at par with them. I mean, there really is becoming, there's this I don't know how to say it, this vacuum or this vacuum of men. We're failing our boys, I believe, at the educational level where it affects them for the rest of their lives.
The research, again, actually shows that there are a number of studies. By the way, the UK and Australia are way ahead on these things than we are. And they have found that when they interview young women, late teen, early 20s, that is a common statement that they don't have anybody that is their intellect. They don't have enough choice for intellectual companionship, let alone emotional companionship.
That's very sad.
Yeah.
And that's a huge problem. And I'm thrilled for the girls. I mean, I'm one that's, I have a graduate degree. I have a law degree. I've got a successful business. Like, I figured out the girl part.
And so does my wife, and so does my daughter. They're both PhDs in psychology.
Awesome.
Practicing psychologists.
And our boys have figured it out, or we've helped them figure it out. But for the rest of the boys, the ones that are failing, and the numbers, you were talking about how it's becoming the percentage of boys and girls, it's becoming greater and greater. I see this as a huge society issue.
It is, and it's one that now I've been looking at this since mid-1990s, and it was just starting to come out a little bit more, but then and more people began to see it, and it became a bigger an issue, and a lot more stuff was written about it. Summers' books, there are a number of books on the issue. Peg Tyer's book, and a number of other authors have written on it. But now we have gotten so wrapped up in the other educational issues that this hasn't even taken a back door. It's taken a back door in another's house, in another neighborhood, in another town. That's how far back it's been pushed, because everybody's push now, regardless of which side of the No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, high stakes testing, Common Core issues that you're on, everybody's focused on those, and this other issue has gone off to the side.
What will our future look like without educated boys?
I'm not sure.
I would guess that there will be more crime. There will be
more unemployment,
more divorce, or more broken families. Right?
They're going to be a lot more societal issues that are going to be a lot more similar nationwide to the societal images that have been going on in urban, predominantly African American societies, subcultures for generations. Because when it was happening in poor, predominantly black neighborhoods, the rest of America really didn't care. They don't pay attention because it's just going on over there. It has nothing to do with us. And if you look at African American communities, you will see this exact problem has been going on for generations. that more black women get ahead. I mean, the statistics show it, and what you're going to see is a replication of that. That the statistics have always shown that black women are more likely to get ahead professionally than black males. The higher crime rate, the higher poverty rate, and all of those things. And it was ignored because in our society we tend to ignore African American problems unless they get flashed up on the front page and involve the rest of us. And you're right. And I think that, again, we don't have to look too far forward. We can look back and see exactly what's going to happen, because if we continue to ignore a certain population and not deal with their issues the way they need to be dealt with, you're right. Those are the kinds of problems that are going to be the result.
So sad.
Absolutely. It's been sad for a small segment of our population, and it's going to get worse for a larger segment.
Tragic. Absolutely. This needs to be given so much attention. We're talking about our boys, our men.
Well, what's ironic is that Arne Duncan's words are going to come back to haunt him on this as well, because he's infamously quoted as saying, the middle class soccer moms, wouldn't pay attention to this because they realize their kids aren't as smart as they thought they were. Well, we know how things work in this country when the middle class gets riled up, and when middle class women get riled up, that's the beginning of a movement. And that's when things can possibly change. And the more and more people see how all of these educational policies are affecting all their kids, and if they're like you, or they're like Peg Tire, or they're like me, or like a lot of mothers who see what's going on with their sons, there are going to be more and more people pushing back against the arrogance, in a sense, of the policymakers.
Well, I can tell you that the moms that I speak with that have boys, we're talking about it. We've seen it. And for that reason, I chose alternatives for my son. And thank God he does great in an environment that suits him, that's good for him, right? Because I believe the traditional system wasn't appropriate for him. But not everybody has the ability to make the choices that I've made for financial reasons or other reasons, right?
Yeah, and that's very true. I was down. I've spoken to groups from every possible political affiliation and ideology over the last few years. And I was down in South Carolina talking to a group primarily of mothers. Many of them homeschool their kids. And we were talking about this, and very honestly, we're saying, listen, and I had gotten at least some. They had heard me talk and heard all the things that I said, so they had trust in what I was saying. I said, what you're doing can be either very good or very dangerous, because we're all not prepared to do that. It's a little bit of almost anybody can teach, kind of thing. So you're right. You have to have the right sets of circumstances. You have to be able to do it. Some of them, this whole issue about charter schools goes back to a time, again, 20 years ago, when teachers and parents were saying, what if we work together to create alternative public high schools that can model the kinds of alternative learning means that can be then used by regular public schools. So again, back in the 1970s, a slew of alternative schools opened up, especially at the high school level, where kids who did not fit the traditional mold would be able to exist, survive, and thrive in a smaller alternative setting that fit their needs. And there are still hundreds of these alternative high schools all across the country that are part of the public school system, but have much more of a community-based understanding of what works. And community means not just parental involvement, which is very strong in many of these, but also the students have a sense of owning their own community and having a voice in how the school is actually run. Incredibly empowering.
Well, David, if I may impose on you what I think is just such an important issue for you to discuss and keep at the forefront of the school systems, of the educators, of the parents, of really the politicians, those that can help shape the educational reform moving forward for our boys, and not to exclude the girls. The girls right now are doing great. You can't.
It's not an either or issue. It's how do you reach, and again, so whether you break it down by gender or learning style or economic condition or socioeconomic condition, what makes a school work or a teacher work or a district work is the ability to understand how to reach as many kids as you can, understanding who they are and where they come from.
Very, very well said. We have unfortunately run out of time, and we will post a recording of the show on livingwealthyradio.com along with the link to your website, David. Thank you so much for joining us today.
And let me add that if they want to hear more or read more about what I've done, they can get my book, which is called Doing the Right Thing, A Teacher Speaks.
Awesome. And your website is dcgmentor.wordpress.com, and we'll also have the link on the website. Again, thank you so much, David.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Living Wealthy Radio on Talk 1370 and streaming live at talk1370.com. I'm Teresa Kuhn, and I hope you'll join me again next week as I show you ways to live wealthier. Resources are available for you on our website at livingwealthyradio.com.